Anthony Tino DeAngelis was a former butcher from the Bronx who built a career trading fats and oils. His record was already checkered. An earlier company he ran, Adolph Gobel, collapsed after the federal government found it had overcharged a school lunch program. In 1955, he started fresh with the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation, operating out of a tank farm in Bayonne, New Jersey. Allied bought crude vegetable oil, refined it, and sold it to exporters. Within a few years, DeAngelis had made himself one of the biggest players in the American vegetable oil trade, and almost nobody looked closely at how. The engine of the fraud was a piece of paper called a warehouse receipt. In a practice known as field warehousing, an independent company takes custody of goods in a borrower's tanks, certifies how much is really there, and issues receipts. Banks then treat those receipts as collateral, lending cash against the certified inventory. The certifier in Bayonne was a subsidiary of American Express, a company whose name meant trust. With American Express receipts in hand, DeAngelis could walk into banks and export houses and borrow enormous sums against oil he claimed to hold. The paper, not the oil, was what moved the money. The oil backing much of that paper did not exist. Investigators later described tanks filled mostly with seawater, topped with a thin layer of vegetable oil so that a measuring line dropped from the top would come up oily. Accounts of the scheme also describe hidden compartments inside tanks and a network of pipes that let the same oil be shuttled from tank to tank between inspections, so a single batch could be counted many times. The inspectors certifying the inventory included staff who had long ties to DeAngelis, and the check stayed shallow for years. Every fraudulent certification became fresh collateral, and fresh collateral became fresh loans. By 1963, the numbers had left reality entirely. Allied claimed roughly 1.8 billion pounds of soybean and cottonseed oil in Bayonne, when the true figure was later put at only about 110 million pounds. Contemporary accounts noted the most damning comparison of all. The oil Allied claimed to hold in that one New Jersey facility exceeded the entire supply of soybean and cottonseed oil in the United States, as reported in government figures. Anyone who had checked Allied's receipts against published national statistics could have seen the impossibility. Some 51 banks and trading firms lent against the paper anyway. DeAngelis was not only borrowing against phantom oil, he was using the money to make a colossal bet in the futures market. After a poor Soviet harvest, he wagered that the Soviet Union would buy huge quantities of American vegetable oil, sending prices soaring. Allied and its brokers bought futures contracts on cottonseed and soybean oil in staggering volume. By the middle of November 1963, Allied controlled around 90% of the cottonseed oil contracts on the New York Produce Exchange. A position that size is a trap of its own making. Prices stayed up largely because Allied kept buying, and even a small decline would trigger margin calls in the millions. In mid-November 1963, the miracle failed to arrive. Prospects for the big Soviet purchase dimmed, and the Commodity Exchange Authority signaled it was investigating the enormous positions in the market. Futures prices for vegetable oil broke sharply. Falling prices meant margin calls, demands for immediate cash to cover losing positions, and Allied had no real assets to meet them. The brokerage houses that had financed the positions, most importantly Ira Hopt and Company, were suddenly on the hook, because a broker must make good on its customers' obligations to the exchange whether or not the customer can pay. The collateral Hopt held against that exposure was, of course, warehouse receipts for oil. In the week of November 18, 1963, Allied filed for bankruptcy. The New York Stock Exchange suspended Ira Hopt and Company and a second firm, J.R. Williston and Bean, on November 20th, because losses flowing from Allied left them unable to meet their obligations. It was the first time in memory that a customer's failure had knocked major member firms off the exchange. Then, on November 22nd, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas and markets plunged before an early close. Wall Street faced a weekend of twin crises, a national trauma and a brokerage failure that threatened the savings of tens of thousands of ordinary customers who had done nothing wrong. When investigators finally measured what was actually in Bayonne, the scale of the deception became undeniable. Against roughly 900,000 tons of claimed oil, there were only about 55,000 tons of the real thing. The receipts held as collateral by banks, exporters, and brokers across the country were largely worthless paper. Total losses were put at more than $150 million, with common estimates running to about $180 million, which is well over $1 billion in today's money. The subsidiary of American Express that had certified the inventory faced claims vastly larger than its own assets, and the question became who would absorb a loss that the fraudster himself could never repay. American Express was not legally required to cover every claim against its warehousing subsidiary, which was a separate corporation with trivial assets. But its leadership concluded that the company's entire franchise rested on trust, and it ultimately paid roughly $60 million to settle claims tied to the fraudulent receipts. The market punished the stock severely in the meantime, with accounts of the decline ranging from about a third to roughly half of its value. One investor read that panic differently. In 1964, Warren Buffett's partnership began buying a major stake in American Express, reasoning that the traveler's check and card businesses were untouched by the scandal. It became one of the most celebrated early investments of his career. The more radical decision came at the New York Stock Exchange. Haupt could not be saved, and its roughly 20,000 customers faced losses on cash and securities trapped inside a failed broker. Rather than let that happen, the exchange organized a rescue funded by assessments on its member firms, committing millions of dollars to liquidate Haupt in an orderly way and make public customers whole. Williston and Bean was stabilized and reopened within days. It was the first time the exchange had taken responsibility for the failure of a member firm, and it established a principle that had never formally existed before, that the innocent customer of a failed broker should not bear the loss. That improvised rescue hardened into institutions. The idea that customer accounts deserve a formal safety net gained force through the brokerage failures of the late 1960s, and in 1970 Congress created the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, which today protects customers of failed brokerage firms within set limits. Lenders overhauled how they treated collateral, and field warehousing certification was never trusted the same way again, with American Express exiting the business. DeAngelis pleaded guilty to federal fraud and conspiracy charges, was sentenced in 1965, and was released in 1972. The oil was fictional, but the reforms it forced were permanent. The salad oil swindle is a lesson in the difference between an asset and a claim on an asset. Every account statement, warehouse receipt, and token of ownership is a piece of paper whose value depends on someone actually holding what it describes, and on someone independent checking. It is why auditors exist, why custody rules matter, and why protections like SCP coverage for brokerage accounts and deposit insurance for banks were created, each one built after a failure that hurt ordinary people. Understanding what stands behind a claim, who verifies it, and what backstops exist if the verifier fails is basic financial literacy. History suggests that the most dangerous paper is the kind everyone assumes someone else has checked.